A few years ago, at summer camps specifically, I started getting a little cynical. I've been doing youth ministry for about 12 years now in different capacities, been a pastor for 8 of those years. But every time I went to summer camps, at the start of my time in youth ministry, I just really loved them. Like all the excitement, all the momentum, I just absolutely loved it. But as time wore on, I just got a little bit more cynical and a little bit more, like whenever I would see something really cool happen at camp, there would be kind of an asterisk on it in my mind. And it was because of 2 kind of phrases that kept popping into my mind. The first was this: the mountaintop high. If you've been to camp, you might have heard this, but when you go to camp, there's a mountaintop, like spiritual high that you experience. And I want to be clear, like, I'm not talking down on it. Like, it's natural. You're around your brothers and sisters. Everything's awesome. We're spending all this time together. We're in the Word. We're in worship. We're in prayer. It makes sense why it would feel awesome. We experience a mountaintop high at camp, but then what happens after the mountaintop? You have to come down the mountain. And that second phrase, coming down the mountain, has become like a thing youth pastors all say to each other. Like when I talk to another youth pastor and a youth pastor is like, yeah, man, how was your summer camp? And I'm like, dude, it was really great. That youth pastor will then look at me and say, how was your coming down the mountain experience? Like, how did it go after? There's a reason he asks, right? If you've had a mountaintop high spiritual experience at camp, like camp just rocked for you, like it was awesome, how does your life feel about a week later? The same as it did before camp, right? Which kind of makes it feel worse, because like your life was one way, you had this tremendous experience at camp, and now your life is back to normal, and you're like, oh, so nothing changed. That's especially true if you had some kind of like never again commitment you made at camp, or you're like, my life is different now, and then you realize your life is kind of the same. This doesn't just happen with camp, this happens across the board. If you come to Anchored on a Wednesday night and like worship just hits for you, and you're like, oh my gosh, worship was so good tonight, then you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and you're caught in that same kind of everyday monotony. Or maybe there's even just a season of your life where like your time in scripture is somehow like way better than it usually is. You're like, oh my gosh, I actually love to read my Bible right now. Like I'm actually loving reading the middle of the book of Leviticus. This is great. Like you're just in it, right? And like this is how it's going to be forever. And then a week passes and how do you feel? The same. An author named Rod Dreher put it this way: everydayness is my problem. Everydayness is my problem. In his book, he says this. He goes, it's not that hard to think about how you would live if you won the lottery, or if your team won the Super Bowl, or if your guy became president, or if you went through a bad breakup, or if there was a loss in your family. It's not that hard to picture how you would live, or even how you would do faith in the extremes of life. That's not that difficult. It might be painful, but it's not difficult. What's very hard is the everyday monotony. What's very hard is waking up in the morning, doing the same thing you always do all day long. You get out of school, you do the homework so you can make the extracurricular or the sport or Anchored or whatever. You get home after that thing, you probably still have homework hanging over your head. You do it all. You go to bed exhausted, you wake up exhausted, whatever alarm you sent, like that snooze button, which is no longer a button, is like destroyed, right? You're doing like the 30 minutes of alarm kind of deal, and you're going into each day with a heavy dose of monotony, and that's where it's hard to do faith. That's where it's hard. I think we always think that faith would be really, really hard if like our lives fell apart. That tends to not be true. When our lives are hard, we tend to dig deep. When our lives are monotonous, in the everydayness of our lives, that's where we struggle to follow Jesus in the real world. And so here's my question for us tonight. What do you do when you don't feel it? What do you do? What do you do when you just don't feel it? What do you do when you've had the camp high, but you can't port that over into your everyday life? What do you do when you had the great Wednesday night, but Thursday still just feels like a Thursday? What do you do when you have the great season of spirituality, but another monotonous one is right after it? What do you do? What I think we do a lot of the time is we think about how we felt at a really mountaintop moment, and what we naturally ask ourselves is this: how do I get more of that? Right? We have a mountaintop spiritual experience, and we're like, how do I get another bit of that? How do I chain those things together? And so what we can end up doing is this. We start looking at Wednesday nights, at camp, at the big spiritual highs of our lives. We tend to look at those things like we need them for our faith to even exist. And I'm not criticizing you, I've been there as well. But maybe right now, if you're signed up for camp, you're looking at camp, and like you on the surface, you're like, yeah, I'm super excited, it's so fun. And on the inside, you're like, I really need this to change my faith. Like, I really need this to change stuff for me. Or maybe you viewed baptism that way. If you were really, really honest, maybe you viewed baptism when you got baptized as a kind of thing where you're like, I'm getting baptized, and I really hope that makes the difference for me. Because I need another mountaintop moment. I need another big experience. So what we end up doing is we start trying to chain together these mountaintop high experiences in our faith, and then we get frustrated when we realize we can't. One of my favorite authors of all time, who's just growing and how much I like him, a guy named Ronald Rolheiser, he named it this way: the quest for another honeymoon. It's like when you got into your faith, when you first started following Jesus, maybe you had like this mountaintop experience when you started following Jesus. Or maybe you went to camp and it was just amazing spiritually. So many of you from camp talked to me and you were like, I've never enjoyed prayer until now. I've never like done the morning quiet time thing and liked it until right now. Maybe you have this big mountaintop high experience, and then we go into the everydayness, the monotony of our lives, and we just are looking for another honeymoon. What Rolheiser says is this, which I think is really fascinating. He goes, I'm convinced that the vast majority of marital affairs and disloyalty happen because someone is looking for another honeymoon. Happens because someone is experiencing the monotony of day-to-day life, and they say, like, this feels nothing like the fiery, zesty moments of the honeymoon. I want more of that. I want life to be up. I want it to be easier. I want life to have its zeal back. I'm going to look for another honeymoon. And Rolheiser goes, if you spend your life looking for another honeymoon, you're going to be completely dissatisfied with the ordinary reality of your life. So what do we do? What do we do if we find ourselves spiritually in a place where we're looking for another honeymoon to sustain our faith? Another one of my favorite authors, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, really well known for being a theologian who tried to assassinate Hitler but failed and was executed for it. He also wrote a book called Ethics right before he did that, so think about that for a minute. A Christian who wrote a book called Ethics who went to assassinate Hitler. Anyway, it's a really fun thing. One of my favorite things he ever wrote is actually his script for officiating weddings. His script for officiating weddings, you can find it, you can read it. And I want you to picture yourself getting married, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a small German man with round glasses, he's officiating your wedding. Not to anyone, maybe it's to someone in this room. I don't know. We should probably talk about that. That's kind of, anyway. But imagine you're getting married. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is officiating your wedding. Here's what he says over you and your soon-to-be new spouse. He says, today, you are very much in love, and you think your love will sustain your marriage. It can't. Imagine, you're like, why did we hire Dietrich? Why didn't we hire, the Elvis impersonator down? That would have been better, right? He says, today, you are very much in love, and you think your love will sustain your marriage. It can't, but your marriage can sustain your love. That says something about the spiritual life that I think we really need to hear. Especially when you're young in your faith, we think that our zeal and our fire and our passion and those mountaintop high moments, we think that will sustain our faith, right? We think if I can be passionate enough about Jesus, if I can have a big enough worship experience, if camp can be big enough for me, if I can enjoy the spiritual life enough, if I can be happy enough in the spiritual life, that will sustain my relationship with Jesus. It won't. Life is too hard. Hype church doesn't work anymore. Life has gotten simply too hard for hype church. Like, rah, rah, let's go, whipped up enthusiasm for following Jesus. That's great if you're just starting to follow Jesus. Not bad at all. You need a honeymoon. You need a honeymoon period. But for 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, 50 years down the line, hype is not going to work for you. You're going to suffer too much, have too much doubt, deconstruct. Something is going to happen to you or around you. Or if you're an Ecclesiastes person, hevel is going to happen to you, right? The unexplainable and uncontrollable is going to happen to you. And hype is not strong enough to withstand the chaos of everyday life. Has anyone noticed that just being a human is harder than you thought it would be? It's just harder. Hype is not going to cut it. Your zeal cannot sustain your relationship with Jesus. But your relationship with Jesus can sustain your zeal. Here's what that looks like. The way that David Brooks, who was a political columnist, who just a couple years ago first started following Jesus out of nowhere, super cool story, wrote a bunch of good books. He said this, also my son's name is Brooks David. Everyone thought I was a huge David Brooks fan. I had no clue who he was. That's how I found out about him. He said this, the key to sustaining any relationship is building a structure of behavior for when love falters. The key to sustaining any relationship is a structure of behavior that stays firm when love falters. Did he say if love falters? He says when. It's true in every relationship you will ever find yourself in. No matter how passionate, zealous, and fiery you feel, the day will come when those feelings aren't at the forefront and you realize relationships are hard and they take work, and the same thing is true of your relationship with Jesus. One of the most helpful things, one of the sophomore guys mentioned this last week. One of the most helpful things in your discipleship to Jesus is treating him like a normal relationship. Like imagining him as not just another friend, but someone in your life. If you hope to sustain a relationship with Jesus, and yes, he sustains you, it's his righteousness, not yours, but if you hope to do your part and invest deeply in a relationship with Jesus, make space for him, two things are true. One, your love and zeal will falter. You don't have enough hype to keep that thing going. No one does. And number two, you're going to need a structure of behavior to fall back on. You're going to need some habits and simple, easy ones. Recently, my wife Jill and I, we started kind of a fun new thing with each other. Some couples are doing date night every week, and I think that's awesome, but we've got 3 kids, almost 4. And so we can't do date night every week. What we do is over Zoom on our lunch hours, and we call it the Lemmer Business Meeting. I'm not kidding. We have a shared Google Doc in our family folder titled Lemmer Business Agenda. It's a shared Google Doc. We add items to our agenda for this meeting. We meet over Zoom. Like, we both work full-time. She's a high school teacher at Emerald High, and so we have to do it this way. But we Zoom once a week, and she's got like a 30-minute lunch hour, and so it's not even like, hey, babe, how are you? How's your day? I'm like, all right, meeting is in session. Someone approved the meeting minutes. Agenda item number 1, there were socks on the floor. We seriously, throughout the week, we add stuff to our business agenda. It's like, this is not like honeymoon stuff. This is like, we're 8 years deep. And it's like, which is not the longest time, but we've realized like we need a business meeting. And so it's literally stuff of like, hey, are you going to clean the garage? Oh, yeah, I totally forgot. Hey, are you going to clean the kitchen? Yeah, I totally forgot. Are you going to fix the front door? Yeah, I totally forgot. This is all Jill forgetting, by the way, not me. Why are you all assuming it's me? So gender rolesy stereotypical of you. Come on. It is me. But we have a business meeting. You know why? Because once we get the kids to bed at night, We have like 30 minutes with each other before we need to go to bed ourselves, so we're not zombies the next day. And if we don't do a business meeting, we will just talk about taxes and house cleanliness and never actually have a relationship with each other. Our weekly business meeting has become a structure of behavior for when love falters. It's become something that withstands the busyness of our lives, knowing that just like red hot love for each other is not going to deal with these problems. Like just being super into each other is not going to carry our marriage, but a structure of behavior might support our relationship and create room for love. Same thing is true of your relationship with Jesus. You don't have enough hype. You don't have enough zeal. When you have it, it's great. It just can't sustain a relationship. And so we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but as high schoolers, on a neurobiological level, your brain is wired to build habits. One of the best things you can do is create daily, consistent habits of doing faith that sustain you when your love falters, when you don't want to be in a relationship at all. Like we talked about, I'm not talking about a half hour of prayer. I'm not talking about reading a book of the Bible every day. Pray the Lord's Prayer for 30 seconds every morning, and that's it. Your spiritual practices should not be aspirational. Your spiritual practices should not be a New Year's resolution that you're going to quit in a couple weeks. Your spiritual practices should be 1,000% doable in the present moment. Don't set up an expectation of prayer that you can't do. Set up an expectation of prayer that you will do every day that is entirely doable for you and maybe a step down. Experiencing a relationship with Jesus is a habit of not being contained to the boxes we put it in. So if you start with a minute of prayer, I bet you'll be doing 5 by the end of the year. Start small, start consistent. But here's one thing we run into. If it's true that we need structured behaviors that we do when we're not feeling it, there's kind of some pushback to that. And it might be in your head right now. And it's one of the things I absolutely adore about your generation. It's your, pardon my French, it's your like radar for BS. See, your generation in particular is hyper aware of authenticity, honesty, and being real. I love that about you. I love that you can't stand glossy, perfect preaching. I love that you like are allergic to just playing church. I love that you want something real and honest. So when we hear about doing like religious behaviors when we don't feel like it, the honest pushback is, isn't that just like going through the motions? Isn't that inauthentic? Isn't that just like kind of like phoning it in? Like I don't want to just go through the motions. I want to feel it. Like, so if I'm not feeling it, I don't want to do all the religious stuff because I don't want to be fake, right? This needs to be real. That's a super great question. Here's my response. There is a difference between inauthenticity and intentionality. There is a difference between being fake and being intentional. Let me give you an example. Last night, I went to hang out with my mom after work for a little bit, so I got home later than I thought I would. And you're not married with kids, so you don't understand what a horrifying thing I'm about to say. I got home after Jill had already prepared, given, and cleaned up dinner for 3 children. It was not expected that would happen. It just so that is a production. It's like a cruise ship, like feeding everybody at once. It's madness. Like Brooks is screaming that he wants Jelly Bellies. Brindley is like, Brooks is annoying, and Wells is just trying to eat the chair. Like it's across. I'm not even gonna tell you what ages my kids are because it doesn't matter. Like they're all just doing weird, and they all switch. Like then Brooks is trying to eat the chair, and Wells is just like, Dad. It's bizarre. It's madness. And so, yeah, seriously, it's creepy. He won't say Mom, which is really funny. Jill's completely fine. But so I get home, and Jill is completely shot. Right? She works full time, so like she had worked a full day, got home, made dinner for all the kids. She was completely shot. Then we did bedtime, which is like being it's not like being hit by a truck. It's like being hit by 3 trucks named Brindley, Brooks, and Wells. But like, it's just like we're trying to potty train Brooks. So he's coming out of his room like 9 different times, being like, gotta go poo-poo, in that voice. and like he can't get like one leg out of his jammies, and so we're afraid of him like falling in the toilet. Which I think would be pretty funny. His reaction would be so funny. I'm not saying I want it to happen. He's just a funny anyway. But it's just madness, and Brindley's just laying in a room loudly being like, "I'm not out of bed," and I'm like, firstborn. And Brooks is just like loudly singing like Moana songs badly, saying loudly, "I'm the crab." But when he says it, he goes, "I'm Gab." Anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. But Jill's exhausted. She's shot, and we get to 8:30 p.m., which to you is very early. To me, I'm like, it's already tomorrow. It's basically next year. Cancel everything. But it's 8:30, and Jill and I, we have a standing, we just talk, it's really novel. We talk to each other like normal people do. But we sit down, and Jill is just shot. I can see it. She's also like 8 months pregnant. But I can see it in her eyes. She's exhausted. She's down to 0 with capacity. And I've had just like a super hard day with a couple things. Like emotionally, I'm just not doing well, and I can feel it in myself of like, I really need someone to talk to right now. And I would love for that to be Jill. Because Jill just gets me. And so I'm like, I really want to talk. I really need Jill to help me process some stuff. But she's shot. But she sees the look in my eye, and like just a wonderful human being that she is. She's like, "What do you need to talk about?" And we ended up having like a 45-minute long, really important conversation I needed to have. Let me ask you, Jill's surface level desires, was it to talk to me or go to bed? Go to bed. No, I'm awesome. It was to talk to me. Have you seen? No. No, girl wants to go to bed very, very reasonably. What's her deeper desire? To be in a relationship with me, right? Because she cares about me, right? Right? Why are you guys laughing? What's so wrong with me? That's her deeper desire, right? Notice this. Well, maybe, I don't know. In that moment, it would have been authentic for Jill to say, "I'm exhausted, I want to go to bed." But instead of just following through on what kind of her surface level desire was, she showed relational intentionality with me and talked to me. Was that fake for her? No, it's loving, right? I experienced that as just love, right? Where I'm like, oh my gosh, like she was so tired, but she cares about me enough that she just gave me space to be a person, and she just listened to me for 45 minutes. What a gem, right? Do you think I appreciated that more or less than when Jill is super awake and just like happy to talk? More. The sacrifice was bigger, right? I saw that she was exhausted. She wasn't feeling it. She didn't really want to have a conversation because she was shot, but she did it anyway because she cares about relationship with me. It's exactly how God views you when you're not feeling it. When you show up in the morning and you're like, last thing I want to do is pray. Last thing I want to do is get in the Word. Last thing I want to do is just sit in God's presence. I'm so distracted. I'm so anxious. When you show up and do it anyway, that's not fake. That's intentional. That is you saying, like, in spite of my feelings, I am going to show up for Jesus because I care about this relationship. Jesus doesn't view you as phoning it in or going through the motions. He views that as you loving him. In the book of James, it says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. It doesn't say draw near to God and make sure you feel it. It says draw near to God, right? Do as far as in your control, draw near to God. I'll tell you this right now. If you show up for God when you feel like it, and let's say you have a great experience, like you really want to worship, so you worship, and the worship experience is great, and it's amazing, that's not meaningless. That really matters. It's like a lighthearted day trip you took with Jesus. No stakes, really fun. But when you show up when you don't want to, when you say, I am willing to show up with Jesus when I don't feel it, ooh, that's faith. That's cold, hard relationship. That is you saying, like, despite my circumstances, I'm going to show up. I'm going to be intentional about relationship. And often what I find is this. If you're in a season like that right now, If you're not at a mountaintop high, if you're like in a valley low, or if you're just in like that crushing, monotonous everydayness of life, and it's just wearing on you, and it feels like a grind to be with Jesus, often what the Holy Spirit is doing in you is he's breaking your addiction to just following Jesus because it feels good. When it feels like a grind to you, when you just show up because you want to invest in relationship and your emotions and your feelings just aren't there with you, when you spend 10 minutes in the Bible and you get no fortune cookie epiphany, that's usually the Spirit being like, I want you to love Jesus for Jesus. I want you to not just love Jesus for how he makes you feel. I want you to love Jesus for Jesus. It's usually the Spirit inviting you into a deeper kind of relationship with him. We experience it as a lack of growth, but in reality, you're probably growing at light speed. It forms you deeply. Again, Ronald Rolheiser, he wrote an awesome little book that when all of you become parents for the first time, I'm going to send you. But it's called Domestic, this is going to be hopefully a very long time from now, but it's called Domestic Monastery, and he paints this cool little metaphor where he says, when a monk is living in a monastery and he hears the bell toll, it's time to pray. It's not asking, do you feel like praying? It's not asking, are you going to get something out of this? It's saying, it's time to pray, and therefore I will. Stubborn loyalty, right? He likens it to a baby crying in the middle of the night, like at 3 in the morning, and saying when your newborn wakes you up at 3 in the morning, that's the bell tolling. Time to go become like Jesus, whether you want to or not, and you're going to do it via service. Maybe you need a bell toll in your life. Maybe your faith is wildly inconsistent. You're waiting for mountaintop highs to carry it, and the Spirit is inviting you into an everyday kind of faith that might not always feel awesome, but you're investing deeply in relationship with Jesus. Maybe you need a bell toll. Maybe you need something in your mind of like, when I wake up in the morning, like the first thing I do is I get on my knees next to my bed and I pray the Lord's Prayer, and then I go about my day. That's enough. That's the only way Jesus ever taught you to pray. Praying the Lord's Prayer is thoroughly enough. You don't need to babble in the presence, right? Praying the Lord's Prayer is enough. Maybe you need a bell toll. Maybe if you're like, man, I don't have time at night or in the morning, but I've got like 10 minutes after school, like from the time I get home to when I start my homework, set an alarm on your phone to remind you to pray. I used to set alarms throughout the day to remind me to do quick little prayers on the spot. Set a bell toll in your life so you remember it's time to do this. Not do I want to, but I will intentionally pour into relationship with Jesus. Last thing I want to say is this. Back to camp. We do camp in a really particular way, and this is not just a big sell for camp, but we think a lot about it. We do camp in a really particular way where we just freaking go for it. Like, we don't pull punches. Like, we just get after God's presence, get after worship. Like, we are going for it. And so I think we have a camp that's worth preparing for personally and spiritually. I think if you just show up to it, great. That's awesome. I'm happy you're there. But if you are already following Jesus, do some everyday faith when you don't feel like it. I guarantee camp will be better for you, even if it's already great. Because here's the thing. When you approach camp like you need it to like reactivate your faith, or if you approach the mission trip like you need this to make a huge difference in your faith, or if you approach baptism like I need this to make the difference and I need this to kind of like spark my faith, you are putting the entire weight of your whole relationship with Jesus on one event. Nothing can bear that weight. It's like a married couple who never connects ever throughout the year, but they go on a really romantic vacation every summer, and they're like, this is going to save our relationship. Is it? No, you're probably going to fight the whole time because you haven't dealt with anything, right? You're probably going to spend all of that vacation just like airing stuff out that you haven't aired out all week. And we actually see that at camp. Sometimes that first night of camp, students just break down because you haven't brought any of your emotional self into the light with Jesus all year long. Not against you being emotional at camp, but I'm saying, man, what if you were doing that work every day in a very small way? Man, what the Spirit could do with a week of uninterrupted time with you at camp. When you do everyday faith with some structured behaviors that go beyond your feelings, go beyond your moods, what you find is this. All of a sudden, the camp experience, you have no expectations for it. You have no need for it to reactivate your faith. You have no need for it to change you. All you want is to be in God's presence. And you will leave camp not feeling like, man, I hope this sticks. You'll leave camp saying, wow, what a wonderful week of being in God's presence. Back to it. Do that. Prepare for camp. Everyday faith, even when you don't feel like it. It's not going through the motions. It's relational intentionality, the same kind of intentionality that Jesus showed you. I'm reminded of this, and I'll close. In the garden before Jesus went to the cross, he prays to the Father. And what does he pray about the cross? He says, take this cup from me if you are willing. This might be heresy. No, it's not. This is on the spot. Man, never riff about a theology of the cross like I'm about to do. Jesus, I don't think Jesus is feeling the cross. When he's in the garden weeping blood, I don't think he's feeling it. I don't think he's having a mountaintop high. I don't think he's like, man, I'm just stoked to go get crucified. Like, I don't think so. I don't think Jesus was a hype train for the cross. He really didn't want to. Like, Jesus didn't want to, but he did it anyway for relational intentionality with you. The cross, the greatest example of relational intentionality with you. I think part of what Jesus means when he says, pick up your cross and follow me, lean into some everyday faith even when you don't want to. Get beyond your feelings and say, Jesus, even when I don't feel it, I'm here. What will you do with me?